The red recording light blinked steadily above camera 2 as Marcus Washington adjusted his tie one final time. Behind him, the sleek newsroom of Unity Broadcasting Network hummed with its usual pre-show energy. 23 years in broadcast journalism had taught him to read the room. And tonight, something felt different. The air crackled with an electricity that had nothing to do with the studio lighting. 30 seconds to air, called Sarah Chen, the floor director, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos. Makeup artists made final touches, while camera operators checked their angles. This was the 8 p.m. flagship broadcast that had built UBN's reputation as the voice of underrepresented communities across the nation. Marcus cleared his throat and looked directly into the lens. Good evening. I'm Marcus Washington, and you're watching Unity Broadcasting Network. Tonight, we continue our investigation into campaign finance irregularities that may have influenced local housing development projects. 3 miles away, in the manicured suburb of Willowbrook, Karen Pemberton sat rigidly in her leather armchair, her manicured fingers gripping a crystal tumbler of wine. The 52-year-old real estate developer had built her empire on knowing the right people and saying the right things at the right moments. Tonight, watching Marcus Washington's measured delivery on her 75-inch television, she felt that familiar surge of righteous indignation. "This is exactly what I've been warning everyone about," she muttered to her husband, Richard, who barely looked up from his laptop. "They're spreading lies, trying to tear down everything decent people have worked for." On screen, Marcus continued his report, displaying documents and charts that detailed questionable transactions between city council members and development companies. His voice remained professional, measured, but Karen heard something else entirely. She heard accusation. She heard threat. She heard the systematic destruction of her carefully constructed world. Richard finally glanced up. "Karen, they're just doing their job. It's called journalism." Journalism. Karen's voice rose an octave. "This is character assassination. They're targeting people like us. Richard, can't you see that?" The segment shifted to an interview with a displaced family, forced from their apartment when their building was demolished for luxury condos. The woman spoke quietly about her children, about the promises made and broken, about the community scattered to the winds. Marcus nodded sympathetically, asking follow-up questions that drew out details Karen found increasingly uncomfortable. Karen's phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Patricia Hensley. "Are you watching this garbage? Someone needs to do something about that station." The wine soured in Karen's mouth as she watched Marcus transition to another segment about educational funding disparities. Each story felt like a personal attack. Each statistic a weapon aimed at dismantling the social order she'd spent decades climbing. By the time the credits rolled, her decision was made. She walked to her kitchen island, where her phone lay charging beside a stack of real estate contracts. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dialed 911, but her voice was steady when the dispatcher answered. 911, what's your emergency? "I need to report a terrorist organization," Karen said, her words crisp and deliberate. "Unity Broadcasting Network on Riverside Drive. They're spreading anti-American propaganda, inciting violence against law-abiding citizens." "Ma'am, can you be more specific about the nature of the threat?" Karen had prepared for this question. "They're coordinating attacks on local businesses, targeting government officials with false information. I have reason to believe they're planning something for tomorrow's city council meeting." The dispatcher's voice sharpened. "What makes you believe this, ma'am?" "I've been monitoring their broadcasts, the coded language, the way they're agitating certain communities. My late father served this country for 30 years, and I know domestic terrorism when I see it." Meanwhile, at UBN headquarters, the newsroom was winding down from another successful broadcast. Jasmine Rodriguez, the investigative producer who'd spent months uncovering the housing development story, saved her files and stretched her arms above her head. The open plan office buzzed with the satisfaction of work well done. "Great show tonight," she called to Marcus, who was reviewing tomorrow's rundown with Sarah Chen. "The housing piece really landed." Marcus smiled, his first genuine expression since the cameras stopped rolling. "Your research made all the difference. Those documents from City Hall were smoking guns." The building's security guard, Miguel Santos, made his rounds on the first floor, checking doors and ensuring the overnight skeleton crew had everything they needed. UBN operated around the clock, with morning show prep beginning at 3 a.m. and digital content updating continuously. The converted warehouse in the Arts District had been transformed into a state-of-the-art facility, its exposed brick walls lined with awards and community recognition plaques. Jasmine packed her laptop into a worn leather messenger bag, a gift from her journalism school professor, who'd encouraged her to pursue investigations that mattered. At 28, she'd already broken stories about police misconduct, environmental racism, and now municipal corruption. Each piece felt like a small victory against the forces that preferred silence. "See you tomorrow," she called to the overnight assignment editor, David Kim, who was already fielding calls about a water main break in the East Side neighborhood. As Jasmine pushed through the glass doors into the cool night air, she had no way of knowing that 12 blocks away, a convoy of black SUVs was assembling in the parking lot of the federal building. Karen's 911 call had triggered a cascade of communications through law enforcement channels, each repetition adding urgency and removing nuance. By midnight, the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force had received a briefing that described UBN as a potential domestic terrorist cell using broadcast media to coordinate attacks on government officials and local businesses. The words "coded language" and "agitating communities" had been transformed into operational communications and insurgent recruitment. Special Agent Lisa Morrison reviewed the intelligence report with growing concern. The 41-year-old veteran of the Bureau had spent 15 years distinguishing between genuine threats and false alarms. But the report's language suggested an imminent danger that demanded immediate response. "What do we know about their programming tonight?" she asked Agent Robert Hayes, who was scrolling through UBN's archived broadcasts on his tablet. "Looks like standard local news," Hayes replied, his brow furrowed. "Housing development story, education funding, community events. Nothing obviously inflammatory." The caller insisted there were coded messages. Sometimes these cells hide in plain sight. Morrison's training kicked in, searching for patterns that might not be immediately apparent. Schedule a dawn raid, full tactical support. If they're planning something for today's city council meeting, we need to move fast. At 5:47 a.m., as the morning show preparation was entering its final hour, Miguel Santos noticed unusual activity on the security cameras. 3 black vehicles had positioned themselves at strategic points around the building's perimeter. His hand moved instinctively toward the alert button that would notify the newsroom. But before he could press it, the front doors exploded inward. Federal agents, everyone on the ground, now. The tactical team moved with military precision, their black gear and assault rifles transforming the familiar newsroom into a war zone. Overhead lights flickered and sparked as equipment was knocked aside. The carefully arranged set where Marcus delivered the news each evening became a chaos of overturned furniture and shouting voices. Jasmine, who'd arrived early to review interview notes, found herself face down on the industrial carpet, her hands zip-tied behind her back, while agents rifled through her desk drawers. The documents she'd spent months gathering: public records, interview transcripts, Financial filings were swept into evidence bags with ruthless efficiency. "What is this about?" she demanded, her voice muffled against the floor. "We're journalists. This is a newsroom." 1. Quiet. The agent standing over her was young, his face hidden behind tactical goggles and a helmet. "You're suspected of coordinating terrorist activities through broadcast communications." Marcus arrived at exactly 6 a.m., his usual time, and walked directly into the maelstrom. Seeing his newsroom transformed into a crime scene, his colleagues zip-tied and threatened. Something crystallized in his mind. This wasn't a mistake or an overreaction. This was targeted destruction. "I'm Marcus Washington, news director of this station," he announced, his hands raised but his voice steady. "I demand to see your warrant and speak with your commanding officer." Agent Morrison stepped forward, her badge visible on a tactical vest. "We have credible intelligence that this organization is using broadcast media to coordinate domestic terrorist activities. You're all being detained pending investigation." Based on what evidence? Marcus's years of interviewing evasive politicians had taught him to press for specifics. What specific terrorist activities? "That's classified information." Morrison's tone brooked no argument. "Secure the servers and all broadcast equipment. Nothing leaves this building." The systematic destruction that followed was methodical and thorough. Computers were disconnected and wheeled away. Video editing stations were dismantled. The server room that housed years of archived broadcasts was sealed with federal evidence tape. In less than 2 hours, Unity Broadcasting Network had been effectively neutralized. But the raid hadn't gone unnoticed. Traffic cameras captured the tactical vehicles surrounding the building. Social media exploded with amateur video from nearby buildings, showing agents in riot gear entering what neighbors knew as their local news station. By 8 a.m., the story was trending nationwide. Karen Pemberton watched the coverage from her breakfast nook with deep satisfaction. Every news channel was carrying the story. FBI raids, suspected terrorist cell, disguised as news station. The crawling text at the bottom of screens mentioned investigations into domestic extremist organizations using media platforms for operational planning. "Finally," she murmured to herself, buttering a croissant with steady hands. Someone took action. Her phone buzzed continuously, with congratulatory messages from neighbors and friends. Patricia Hensley texted, "You were so right about that place. Thank God someone was paying attention." The president of her homeowners association called to commend her civic vigilance. Her real estate colleagues shared the news stories with comments about the importance of community watchfulness. But Karen's victory felt incomplete. Unity Broadcasting had been silenced, but other voices still spoke uncomfortable truths. The morning news mentioned similar raids being planned on minority-owned media outlets in Detroit, Phoenix, and Atlanta. Apparently, her 911 call had sparked a nationwide investigation into what authorities were calling a coordinated domestic terrorism network using community media as cover. Richard found her in the living room, surrounded by printed news articles and open laptops. "Karen, this is getting out of hand. They're arresting journalists." "They arrested terrorists," she corrected, highlighting another article about additional raids. "People who were using the media to undermine our communities, our values, our way of life." "Based on what your phone call," Richard's voice carried a note she'd rarely heard in 25 years, of marriage doubt. "Karen, what exactly did you tell them?" She looked up from her laptop, her expression hardening. "I told them the truth. That station was spreading propaganda designed to tear down everything decent people have built. They were targeting businesses, government officials, trying to destabilize our community. They were reporting the news. Karen, that housing development story. Those are public records. The education funding disparities. Those are documented facts. Facts presented with an agenda. Karen snapped. Facts weaponized against people like us. I saw through their coded language, their dog whistles. I recognized the pattern. Richard stared at his wife as if seeing a stranger. What pattern? What coded language? But Karen had already returned to her laptop, scrolling through social media reactions to the raids. The comment sections were battlegrounds of opinion, but her allies far outnumbered the critics. People understood the threat. People appreciated her courage in calling it out. In a federal holding facility across town, Marcus Washington sat in an interrogation room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and fear. His lawyer, Amanda Torres, had arrived 2 hours earlier and was systematically dismantling the government's case with the precision of a surgeon. "Let me understand this correctly," she said to Agent Morrison, who sat across from them with a thick file folder. "Your entire operation was based on a single, anonymous tip claiming my client's news station was a terrorist cell." "The tip was specific and credible," Morrison replied, though her confidence seemed less solid than it had been at dawn. The caller provided detailed intelligence about operational planning and coded communications. "Specifically, what operational planning?" Amanda leaned forward, her pen poised over a legal pad. "What coded communications?" Morrison opened the file and read from her notes. The suspect organization was reportedly using broadcast journalism to coordinate attacks on local businesses and government officials. The caller specifically mentioned planning for yesterday's city council meeting. "Yesterday's city council meeting," Amanda repeated, where the only item on UBN's coverage agenda was a report on the proposed budget allocations, which, I should mention, is public information available on the city's website. Marcus watched the exchange with growing clarity. Someone had weaponized law enforcement against his newsroom, using the machinery of national security to silence inconvenient journalism. The question was who, and why now? "Agent Morrison," he said quietly, "have you reviewed any of our actual broadcasts, our investigative reports, our community coverage?" "That's part of the ongoing investigation." "So you raided a newsroom, detained journalists, and seized our equipment without reviewing the content you claim is threatening." Marcus's voice remained calm, but his words carried the weight of 2 decades in broadcast journalism. "You took someone's word that we were terrorists without fact-checking their claims." Morrison's silence spoke volumes. Amanda Torres smiled grimly and made another note on her legal pad. 3 days later, as federal investigators scrambled to justify their actions and media outlets nationwide demanded answers, an unexpected source provided clarity. FBI Special Agent Thomas Chen, no relation to UBN's floor director, Sarah Chen, had been reviewing digital evidence from Karen Pemberton's electronics as part of standard procedure following false terrorism reports. What he found in her email archives and text message history painted a disturbing picture of coordinated harassment targeting minority-owned media outlets. Karen's communications revealed connections to a political consulting firm called Strategic Communications Associates, which had been quietly working to silence critical news coverage ahead of the upcoming election cycle. The emails were damning in their explicitness. "Target acquired," read one message sent to an SCA operative the morning after UBN's housing development story aired. "Local news station, spreading anti-development propaganda. Recommend immediate action to neutralize." Another email thread discussed the effectiveness of false terrorism reports in shutting down problematic media outlets. Phoenix operation successful, reported another SCA affiliate. Station offline indefinitely. Recommend similar approach for Atlanta and Detroit targets. Agent Chen brought his findings directly to FBI Director Sarah Matthews, who read the communications with growing horror. The Bureau had been manipulated into conducting a coordinated attack on press freedom, weaponized by political operatives seeking to silence inconvenient journalism during a critical election period. "How many stations were targeted?" Director Matthews asked, her voice tight with controlled fury. 17 so far, all minority-owned, all covering stories that could impact local elections, housing, environmental justice, police misconduct, municipal corruption. Agent Chen pulled up a map showing the targeted outlets across 8 states. They've been systematic and effective. Effective at destroying American journalism. Matthews replied, "I want arrests, warrants for everyone involved, starting with Karen Pemberton and working up through Strategic Communications Associates to whoever's funding this operation." The arrest came at dawn, just as Karen was reviewing the morning news coverage of additional media raids. She answered the door in her silk robe, expecting to see her neighbor Patricia with coffee and congratulations. Instead, she found Agent Chen flanked by 2 federal marshals. "Karen Pemberton, you're under arrest for filing false terrorism reports, conspiracy to deprive civil rights, and participating in a criminal enterprise designed to suppress freedom of the press." The handcuffs felt cold against her wrists as Agent Chen read her Miranda rights. Behind her, Richard stood in the foyer, his face pale with shock and something that looked like relief. "This is ridiculous," Karen protested as she was led toward the unmarked car. "I reported a legitimate threat to community safety. Those people were dangerous." "Mrs. Pemberton, we have your emails with Strategic Communications Associates. We know about the coordinated campaign to silence minority media outlets. This isn't about community safety. This is about election manipulation." As the car pulled away from her pristine suburban home, Karen's neighbors watched from their windows. The morning joggers paused on the sidewalk. The school bus driver slowed to observe the unusual scene. By noon, the arrest was headline news on every station that hadn't been targeted by her false reports. The federal hearing on press freedom that convened 3 weeks later drew national attention. The Hart Senate Office Building's largest committee room was packed with journalists, civil rights advocates, and constitutional scholars. C-SPAN carried the proceedings live as senators questioned FBI officials about the coordinated raids on minority-owned media outlets. Senator Maria Gonzalez of California led the questioning with the precision of a former prosecutor. "Director Matthews, how did the FBI allow itself to be weaponized against American journalism?" "Senator, we were presented with what appeared to be credible intelligence about imminent terrorist threats. Our agents acted on that intelligence in good faith, following established protocols for national security threats." Good faith. Senator Gonzalez's voice sharpened. "Your agents raided 17 newsrooms, detained dozens of journalists, and seized millions of dollars worth of broadcasting equipment based on anonymous phone calls that you never independently verified." Marcus Washington watched from the gallery as Director Matthews acknowledged the Bureau's failures. Beside him sat Jasmine Rodriguez and other journalists whose careers had been disrupted by the raids. The hearing represented more than accountability. It was a public validation of their work and their rights. When Marcus was called to testify, he approached the witness table with the same measured dignity he brought to his news desk each evening. His voice was clear and strong as he described the raid on UBN headquarters. "Senators, What happened to Unity Broadcasting Network and the other targeted outlets represents a fundamental attack on the role of journalism in American democracy. We were silenced, not because we reported falsehoods, but because we reported truths that certain interests found inconvenient. He paused, looking directly at the C-SPAN cameras that were broadcasting his words to millions of viewers. The housing development corruption we exposed. Those public records are still public. The education funding disparities we documented. Those inequities still exist. The voices of displaced families we amplified, they're still seeking justice. Silencing journalists doesn't eliminate problems. It just hides them in darkness. The committee room was silent as Marcus concluded his testimony. We demand more than apologies and policy reforms. We demand the immediate release of our seized equipment, full restoration of our broadcasting capabilities, and accountability for those who corrupted the justice system to advance their political agenda. Karen Pemberton's trial began 6 months later in federal district court. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, methodically presented evidence of the conspiracy to silence minority media outlets. Email communications, phone records, and financial documents painted a picture of systematic election interference disguised as counterterrorism. Karen's defense team argued that she genuinely believed UBN posed a threat to community safety. Her attorney, Robert Sterling, portrayed her as a concerned citizen who'd been manipulated by sophisticated political operatives. My client was led to believe that reporting suspicious media activity was her patriotic duty. Sterling argued during opening statements. She was used by cynical political operators who exploited her genuine concerns about community safety. But the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Text messages showed Karen celebrating the raids on media outlets. Email threads revealed her coordination with Strategic Communications Associates operatives. Financial records documented payments to her real estate company from accounts linked to the political consulting firm. The most damaging testimony came from Marcus Washington himself. When Prosecutor Walsh asked him to describe the impact of the raid on UBN's operations, his answer was devastating in its simplicity. We lost 6 months of community journalism, he said quietly. 6 months when corruption went unreported, when displaced families had no voice, when environmental hazards went unnoticed. 6 months when our community was silenced because someone decided our stories were inconvenient truths. Karen sat rigidly at the defense table, her earlier confidence eroded by weeks of damning testimony. The neighborhood hero narrative she'd constructed crumbled under the weight of evidence showing her role in a nationwide conspiracy against press freedom. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, when they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts. Karen's composure finally broke. Her sobs echoed through the courtroom as Judge Patricia Hammond read the charges: conspiracy to deprive civil rights, filing false terrorism reports, and racketeering. Mrs. Pemberton, Judge Hammond said at sentencing, you used the power of federal law enforcement as a weapon against American journalism. You corrupted the justice system to silence voices you found uncomfortable. This court sentences you to 8 years in federal prison and orders the forfeiture of assets totaling $2.3 million in restitution to the affected media outlets. The Unity Broadcasting Network returned to the air on a Tuesday evening in March, exactly 1 year after the raid that had silenced them. The newsroom bore scars from its ordeal. New equipment replaced what had been seized. Fresh paint covered walls damaged during the tactical operation, and memorial plaques honored the journalists who'd been detained. But the spirit remained unchanged. Marcus Washington sat behind his familiar news desk, his tie perfectly knotted, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fought for the right to speak truth to power. Good evening, I'm Marcus Washington, and you're watching Unity Broadcasting Network. Tonight, we return to the work of journalism after a year-long fight for our right to exist. Behind the cameras, Jasmine Rodriguez smiled as she watched her colleagues reclaim their roles. The investigations that had been interrupted by the raid were back in development. The housing development corruption story that had triggered Karen's false report was being updated with new evidence of municipal fraud. The voices of displaced families would once again find amplification through UBN's community coverage. The ratings for UBN's return broadcast broke every record in the station's history. Viewership extended far beyond their traditional local audience, as millions of Americans tuned in to witness the resurrection of a newsroom that had become a symbol of press freedom. Social media exploded with support messages. Unity Broadcasting trended worldwide as journalists, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens celebrated the triumph of truth over suppression. Other minority-owned outlets that had been targeted by the conspiracy reported similar surges in audience support. During the broadcast's final segment, Marcus addressed the camera with unusual directness. A year ago, someone tried to silence this newsroom by weaponizing fear and hatred against journalism. They failed because truth is more powerful than lies, because justice is stronger than corruption, and because democracy depends on free and independent media. He paused, his expression softening slightly. To our viewers, who never stopped believing in our mission, to the journalists who stood with us during our darkest hours, and to everyone who understands that press freedom is everyone's freedom, thank you. We're back, we're stronger, and we're not going anywhere. As the credits rolled over UBN's restored logo, viewers across the nation understood they'd witnessed more than a television broadcast. They'd seen democracy repair itself, justice prevail over manipulation, and truth emerge triumphant from its enforced silence. The red recording light above camera 2 continued blinking steadily, a beacon of press freedom that no false accusation could extinguish. In newsrooms across America, journalists who'd watched UBN's ordeal understood the message their work mattered. Their voices were essential, and their right to speak truth to power was worth defending at any cost. Karen Pemberton began serving her sentence at Federal Correctional Institution Tallahassee the following month. Her former neighbors in Willowbrook avoided mentioning her name, though several had quietly donated to press freedom organizations in what felt like community penance. Strategic Communications Associates was dissolved by court order, its assets frozen and distributed to the media outlets it had targeted. Richard Pemberton filed for divorce 3 weeks after Karen's sentencing. He moved to a smaller house across town and began volunteering with a local media literacy organization, teaching community groups to distinguish between legitimate journalism and propaganda. The housing development corruption that had started it all was finally prosecuted after UBN's returned broadcasts provided fresh evidence of municipal fraud. 3 city council members were indicted, 2 real estate companies were fined millions in damages, and displaced families received settlements that allowed many to return to their gentrified neighborhoods. On a warm evening in late spring, as Marcus Washington prepared for another broadcast, he reflected on the year that had tested everything he believed about journalism and democracy. The newsroom hummed with its familiar energy, but the experience had changed everyone who lived through it. Jasmine Rodriguez approached his desk with a folder of documents. "New story developing," she said with a smile that carried echoes of their shared ordeal. "Environmental cleanup delays in the Riverside district. Looks like another case of priorities misplaced." Marcus nodded, reviewing the preliminary research with the same attention to detail that had made UBN trusted in its community. "Good work. Let's make sure we get this right." As the red recording light prepared to blink on once more, Unity Broadcasting Network stood as proof that truth, when defended with courage and principle, can survive any assault. The station's motto, inscribed on a new plaque near the main entrance, captured the lesson learned through their ordeal. Truth interrupted is not truth defeated. The evening news began on schedule, carrying stories that mattered to a community that had learned to value the voices that speak uncomfortable truths. In living rooms across the viewing area, families settled in to watch journalism practiced with integrity, knowing they were witnesses to democracy's essential promise that truth, however inconvenient, deserves to be heard. And in a federal prison cell 3 states away, Karen Pemberton faced the consequences of trying to silence that truth. Her comfortable certainties replaced by the harsh reality that democracy's enemies are often those who claim to defend it. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of weaponizing fear against freedom, while Unity Broadcasting Network's survival became inspiration for journalists everywhere who refused to be silenced by those who preferred darkness to light.